The Fire at Year Zero and Identity Fracture. To map the psychological matrix of Shinra Kusakabe, one must chart the exact coordinate where his childhood ended and his psychological survival mechanism began. In clinical psychology, identity is not a static construct. It is a fluid architecture built upon layers of environmental stability, predictable attachment, and systemic safety. For a child, the family unit serves as the primary orienting framework for reality. It is the lens through which a developing mind learns to categorize the world as either benevolent or hostile, safe or perilous. When a sudden, violent catastrophe destroys this framework, the result is an immediate and catastrophic phenomenon known as identity fracture. This is not a standard emotional wound that heals with time. It is a structural split in the psyche. It creates an absolute unbridgeable chasm between the self before and the self after. The individual is forced to reconcile two entirely different realities that cannot logically coexist within the same history. Before the fire, Shinra existed in a state of developmental equilibrium. He was a normal child anchored by a secure attachment to his mother and reinforced by his role as an older brother to Sho. His psychological needs were met through consistent emotional mirroring. His mother validated his emotions, protected his vulnerability, and regulated his anxieties. In this environment, his emerging sense of self was grounded in safety, belonging, and healthy aspiration. The outbreak of the fire did not merely inflict physical destruction, it shattered his existential orientation. In a matter of minutes, the primary sources of his emotional regulation, physical safety, and structural identity were obliterated. When a child is thrust into an overwhelming crisis devoid of parental protection, the nervous system experiences an extreme state of disorganization. The brain's limbic system, flooded with stress hormones, struggles to categorize the event, resulting in a profound trauma response. The world ceases to be a predictable space governed by cause and effect, transforming instead into a chaotic landscape where annihilation can occur without warning. For Shinra, this disorganization was compounded by a severe developmental cognitive distortion, the personalization of tragedy. Because children possess an egocentric cognitive framework, they naturally struggle to comprehend cosmic randomness or complex systemic failures. If a catastrophic event occurs within their immediate orbit, their internal logic dictates that they must be the causal agent. Even when external facts prove their innocence, the child's mind constructs an internal narrative of culpability. If I had been faster, if I had been stronger, if I had been better, they would still be here. This cognitive misstep forms the bedrock of survivor's guilt, a psychological condition where the individual perceives their own survival not as a gift, but as a moral failure. Shinra did not just survive a fire, he inherited an existential debt. From the ashes of his childhood home, a new version of Shinra was born, one whose entire psychic energy was dedicated to justifying his continued existence in a world where his family was consumed. Internalized stigma and the social construction of a monster. The psychological damage of Shinra's childhood was not confined to the immediate aftermath of the fire. It was systematically exacerbated by his subsequent socio-environmental conditioning. Identity formation is a relational process. An individual learns who they are by observing how their social environment responds to them. In healthy development, society acts as a mirror that reflects validation, acceptance, and a sense of shared humanity. For Shinra, however, the social mirror was profoundly distorted. Following the tragedy, the surrounding community, fueled by media sensationalism and a collective fear of spontaneous human combustion, required a scapegoat to make sense of an otherwise incomprehensible horror. They chose the surviving child. Almost instantly, Shinra was subjected to an aggressive campaign of social labeling. He was no longer treated as a grieving orphan who had witnessed the gruesome death of his family. He was categorized as a devil, a monster, and a freak. In sociology and social psychology, this is recognized as the process of stigmatization. When a powerful group applies a negative label to a vulnerable individual, that label alters the individual's social reality. Shinra was subjected to systemic ostracization. Peers avoided him, adults whispered in his presence, and the collective gaze of his community shifted from sympathy to overt hostility and suspicion. Every fearful glance from a passerby, every cruel comment from a classmate, and every institutional failure to protect him reinforced a singular message: you are the threat, you are the anomaly. Identity conflict, fighting the forced narrative. The true tragedy of long-term stigmatization is the inevitability of internalized stigma. This occurs when a marginalized individual begins to accept the negative stereotypes and labels imposed upon them by their environment, incorporating them into their own self-concept. Even as Shinra consciously rejected the accusation that he killed his family, the subconscious weight of the label began to alter his psychic landscape. When a developing mind is continuously saturated with the narrative that it is inherently evil or dangerous, a profound internal conflict arises. The individual begins to look at their own traits, their physical appearance, their unique abilities, and their emotional reactions through the suspicious lens of their oppressors. Shinra spent his formative years trapped within this psychological prison. He was forced to construct his daily identity in direct opposition to a societal narrative that he never chose, expending vast amounts of emotional energy to prove he was not the monster everyone claimed he was. The anatomy of the devil's grin as an involuntary, affective response. There is no greater manifestation of Shinra's fractured psychology than his involuntary smile, a behavioral trait that serves as the definitive visual marker of his trauma. Within the narrative of Fire Force, casual observers and early adversaries frequently misinterpret this grin as a sign of arrogance, emotional detachment, sadistic amusement, or psychological instability. In reality, from a clinical perspective, this smile represents a highly sophisticated, involuntary somatic defense mechanism born out of absolute emotional overwhelm. When the human nervous system encounters a level of stress, terror, or grief that exceeds its capacity for emotional processing, the brain's traditional channels of expression become blocked. Under normal circumstances, intense fear triggers a fight, flight, or freeze response, typically accompanied by facial expressions of distress, panic, or sorrow. However, when these standard emotional expressions have historically led to further trauma, rejection, or danger, the psyche adapts by creating an alternate somatic pathway. Shinra's facial muscles lock into a rigid, jagged smile precisely when he experiences his most acute moments of psychological vulnerability. This phenomenon is deeply linked to the concept of emotional dysregulation and nervous system hijacking. The smile is not a conscious choice. It is an involuntary muscular spasm, a psychological shield that clamps down over his face to hide the agonizing vulnerability underneath. This involuntary response creates a deeply tragic interpersonal paradox that defines Shinra's social isolation. The inversion of emotional mirroring. Human beings rely on emotional mirroring to foster empathy, connection, and social safety. When an individual expresses sadness, others perceive that distress and offer comfort, which helps regulate the individual's nervous system. Shinra's somatic response completely disrupts this loop. The vulnerability trap. When Shinra is at his most terrified, his face displays a threatening manic grin. When he is grieving, he appears amused. When he desperately needs comfort, his face communicates hostility and danger, the reenactment of stigma. Because his environment perceives his smile as proof of his monstrous nature, his involuntary defense mechanism actively confirms the community's worst biases. The more frightened he is, the more monstrous he looks, which causes people to react with fear and hostility, thereby re-traumatizing him and reinforcing the need for the smile. Shinra is effectively trapped within his own body, forced to navigate an agonizing disconnect where his internal emotional reality is completely masked by his external presentation. He is crying out for connection internally while his face warns the world to stay away. The defensive hero archetype and the battle for existence. To fully grasp Shinra's driving motivation, his absolute unyielding desire to become a hero, one must discard the traditional shonen trope of altruistic ambition. For most protagonists, the path of the hero is born out of a desire for honor, a dedication to a grand dream, or a simple wish to protect a community. For Shinra, heroism is not an elective path or an idealistic aspiration. It is an urgent strategy for psychological survival. It is an aggressive, defensive counter-narrative designed to systematically dismantle the devil identity that society forced upon him. When an individual's right to exist is continuously called into question by their social environment, they are left with very few psychological options. They can succumb to the pressure and accept the negative identity. Becoming the monster society expects them to be a path chosen by many villains within the Fire Force universe. Alternatively, they can launch a psychological counterattack, building an identity so overwhelmingly positive, noble, and undeniable that it completely invalidates the societal stigma. This is the origin of Shinra's hero complex. For Shinra, the statement, "I am a hero," is an armor he puts on to protect his vulnerable self-worth. Every time he enters a burning building, every time he puts his life on the line to subdue an inferno, and every time he shields a civilian, he is collecting evidence. He is building an objective case to present to the world and to his own doubting subconscious that proves his life has value. His heroism is inherently compensatory. He is trying to balance an imaginary ledger of guilt that was opened the night his family died. This transforms his relationship with failure into an existential threat. If a standard hero fails to save someone, they experience normal grief and professional disappointment. If Shinra fails to save someone, his entire psychological defense system collapses. Failure strips away his hero armor, leaving him entirely exposed to the societal accusation that he is a destructive force, a devil, a harbinger of death. He does not merely want to save lives, he must save lives because each successful rescue is a temporary reprieve from his deep-seated fear of worthlessness. Somatic manifestations of fire and the pyrokinetic metaphor. In academic, literary, and psychological analysis, the nature of a character's supernatural ability often serves as an extension of their internal mental state. In Fire Force, the generation and manipulation of flames is not merely a localized power system, it functions as a profound metaphor for the processing of emotional trauma. Shinra's specific evolutionary gift, the ability to generate intense, explosive flames from his feet, earning him the moniker Devil's Footprints, is a literal somatic manifestation of his internal rage, grief, and survival instinct. Fire is an element of dualities. It represents complete destruction, annihilation, and terror, but it also represents warmth, illumination, purification, and transformation. This duality mirrors the trajectory of severe trauma. Trauma can utterly destroy the existing structures of the mind, leaving behind a scarred, barren landscape. However, the energy generated by that survival experience can also be channeled into a transformative force of resilience. Shinra's flames erupt from his lower limbs, the foundation of his physical stance. When he fights, his fire drives him forward at speeds that defy human perception. Psychologically, this indicates a desperate need for velocity, a somatic urge to outrun his past, to outpace his memories, and to break through the stagnant social constructs that trap him. Notice too how his power forces him to interact with the world. Unlike pyrokinetics who project fire from their hands as an external tool, Shinra's fire is deeply integrated with his physical body. His flames require direct physical contact, delivered through high-velocity kicks. Every strike he lands is a raw physical confrontation with his environment. He is literally kicking his way through a world that rejected him. His flames are fueled by his emotional intensity. The deeper his distress, the hotter and more volatile his fire becomes. This creates an intense internal pressure cooker. He must maintain a level of emotional control over his abilities, lest his fire consume him and transform him into the very monster society fears. The management of his pyrokinetic gifts is a direct reflection of his daily management of his psychological trauma, a constant, delicate calibration of an explosive force that can either save the world or reduce it to ashes. The split self and the burden of the chosen one. As the narrative of Fire Force progresses, Shinra's psychological burden shifts from localized societal rejection to an immense apocalyptic weight. He is revealed to possess the Adola Burst, an untainted primordial flame that links him directly to the source of all creation and destruction. This revelation instantly yanks him out of the realm of ordinary human suffering and thrusts him into the role of an archetypal chosen one. From a mental health perspective, being designated as a central figure in a cosmic destiny does not alleviate existing trauma. It severely complicates it, creating an agonizing dynamic known as the split self. Shinra is suddenly forced to house two entirely distinct identities within his single consciousness. On one side is the inner child, the grieving, deeply lonely orphan who simply wants a family. local acceptance, and the freedom to express his pain without being called a demon. On the other side is the cosmic hero, the bearer of humanity's survival, the ultimate warrior who must navigate global conspiracies, religious cults, and existential threats to prevent a second cataclysm. This creates an intense state of psychological isolation. Shinra cannot easily communicate the simple human needs of his inner child because the world around him is hyper-focused on his value as a cosmic weapon. He must project absolute confidence, strength, and unwavering heroism to maintain public morale and keep his allies focused. This division prevents him from engaging in necessary emotional vulnerability. He cannot admit to being tired, terrified, or deeply uncertain without risking the stability of the entire collective effort. The burden of the Chosen One forces him to sacrifice his personal healing for the sake of global salvation, burying his foundational trauma even deeper beneath the weight of his destiny. The reconstruction of the ashes and the cure of connection, frozen grief, and the clinical dynamics of survivor's guilt. The psychological profile of Shinra Kusakabe cannot be complete without an exhaustive examination of his emotional stagnation, a condition described in clinical settings as frozen grief. Grief is not a passive state that dissolves over time. It is an active, demanding psychological process that requires specific environmental conditions to reach resolution. It requires complete safety, emotional validation, a supportive social network, and the freedom to express sorrow without fear of judgment or consequence. When a person is denied these conditions in the immediate wake of a tragedy, their grieving process is violently interrupted, causing their emotional development to lock in place at the exact moment of impact. For Shinra, the conditions for healthy mourning were non-existent. Following the catastrophic fire, his environment became highly hostile. Instead of receiving the intensive emotional care required by a child who had just witnessed the destruction of his family, he was placed on trial by the public gaze. The immediate need to defend his innocence, to survive the daily onslaught of social rejection, and to learn to navigate his volatile pyrokinetic abilities forced his ego to adopt an emergency stance. He had to bury his sorrow beneath an iron layer of survival instincts. His mind made an executive, unconscious decision. Mourning is a luxury that requires vulnerability, and vulnerability in this world will get you destroyed. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like and subscribe.